Today we're talking about seed starting mistakes because, well, I made a lot of them. And I've talked a lot about seed starting mistakes in the past, but in today's episode, we're gonna cover some additional seed starting mistakes that we haven't talked about. So if you've seen those other videos, stay tuned, you're gonna love this video. And I'm really hoping that through this video, you're gonna stop from making the mistakes, well, before you make them. First mistake is starting with containers that are too big. Now, a lot of gardeners think that the bigger the container, the more forgiveness you have, right? It's less room to fail. In fact, it's actually more room to fail, and I'll explain why. All right, so I'm hopefully gonna explain this in pretty simple to understand terms. These little cells here are containers. A container is just something that holds something else. And so these are little containers. They're 1 inch by 1 inch, right? They're pretty small little containers. This is a 6-cell container, but each one of these cells is technically a container as well. These are 2.5 inches by 2 inches roughly. And so they're quite a lot larger and they hold quite a lot more soil, probably 6 times the amount of soil than these little cells do. Moving up here, we got a 5-inch pot. This right here is quite a lot larger. I mean, this probably holds 6 times, maybe 6 times the amount of soil that these have. So comparatively, this is probably, I don't know, 50 times the amount of soil, just throwing out random numbers that seem kind of accurate. You know how I operate, but you're getting the point. You move up to this is 1.7 gallons of soil in this container. And there's something that happens outside that does not happen inside or as easily, and that is evaporation. Evaporation still can happen indoors, but it happens at a much slower pace. And that's precisely why our potatoes in containers, they're in a 3-gallon container. That's a lot of soil. That's 3 gallons of soil. And what we have to be very careful of is managing overwatering. Because what can happen in these containers here is if you don't understand that cell size, the container size, has a direct correlation to how much water is held in the soil, you're gonna mess up seed starting your whole life, because that is one of the most critical things, is managing moisture. Moisture control is everything when seed starting. If it's too dry, seeds will sprout and then they'll wither and die. If it's too damp, they'll sprout and they'll immediately rot. You'll have things like damping off, root rot, mold, fungus. A ton of different problems can happen when the soil is kept too damp. And the problem is the larger the container you go up, the longer it takes for that soil to dry out to that sweet spot. You know, contrary to popular belief, plants don't like, well, they don't like it bone dry, but they certainly don't like it damp all the time. Right after you water, you might think to yourself, ooh, that soil looks good, it looks well watered. The problem is, plants don't like that to be the case all the time. They like it about 50% drier than that. They like it to be damp, but not so damp that you can notice it and you can feel it and you can start to smell the dampness, right? They don't like that. That's where problems can occur. And so we want to make sure that we go with a cell that is large enough to hold our seeds, kind of allow them to grow for 2 to 3 weeks, up to maybe about a month, and no more than that. Because at that point, you should be moving them up to a larger container. All right, second biggest mistake I see a lot of gardeners making is once you have picked out the right size container, for us, we're gonna be starting a lot of these herbs here in these little 1 inch by 1 inch cells. That's the right size container for us. And we can manage the moisture properly, like we talked about in point number 1. But the second biggest mistake is overpacking the cells. Now this contributes to moisture retention, just like we talked about in point number 1. When you have your cells here and you've filled them up with soil, one of the biggest mistakes I see so many gardeners making is taking their fingers and cramming them in there to pack those cells with as much soil as possible. And logic would say, well, I'm reducing air gaps. Air gaps are not good for root development. And that is correct, absolutely correct. However, when you start to compress too much, you start to go, again, there's always, in everything in life, there's balance, right? You have a Goldilocks scenario in everything. It's either too hot or it's too cold. It's either too hard, too soft, right? There's too much air gaps, or in this case, you guessed it, not enough air gaps. And so when you take your fingers and you poke them into your cells, or you're taking your hand and you're trying to compress the soil in to reduce that those air gaps, what you're doing is over time, if you're really pressing down hard, you're taking all of that air and you're removing it from the soil. And that air is critical for root development. It's also critical for drainage, right? Water retention is something that it's necessary, but if it retains too much water, say it with me, damping off, root rot, gray mold, black mold, powdery mildew, fungus gnats, you've heard me say it, I'll say it again. You don't want to cram your seeds, you don't want to cram the soil in your seed starting trays. What you want to do is you want to apply gentle pressure, right? Gentle pressure. And I've always said this is a great way for me to understand this, is if you push on your eye, the level of force that you'd apply to your eye, your closed eyelid, right? Before it becomes uncomfortable, that's how much you want to press. Same thing. That's how much you want to press, right? You wouldn't push your eye to the back of your skull. You shouldn't do the same thing to your seed starting trays. All right, third biggest mistake I see a lot of gardeners making is not using a UV resistant marker. Now, I have talked about this so many times in the past, and I'm throwing in this video because, well, I'm sick and tired of seeing people that use Sharpies or pens or chalk, and then after they water and they sit underneath their grow lights or sit outside for 1 or 2 months, what happens is all of a sudden they fade and they don't know what they've planted and they have no idea what's what. I can safely say that in my I'd say top 5 must-have tools is this sucker right here. Now we carry these over at MIgardener.com, but you can get them literally anywhere. If you don't want to go over there and get one, that's fine. These things are dirt cheap and they will save not only your garden, but also your sanity, because these are UV resistant. There's a chemical, I don't know what is in this. It's alcohol-based ink, but it's water and fade resistant. And we've literally left these outside for an entire season, even to the next season. And I don't know what is necessarily the magic that has to do with these markers here, but I'd recommend them for literally anybody. They're less than $5, and honestly, I mean, a Sharpie basically costs $2.50. So you're paying like twice as much for something that's literally gonna last you a lifetime. This marker I've been using for the past 4 years and it still works just fine. And it never fades. So that is one thing I have to drive home, is that so many gardeners, especially when you're beginning gardening and you don't understand how to identify things or remember where you planted, or if you're like in my case, I'm gonna start 12 different things in this tray. I gotta know what's what. And so this little tool right here is an absolute lifesaver. Definitely one of the bigger mistakes I see gardeners making is not using a UV resistant marker. All right, fourth biggest mistake I see a lot of gardeners making, and I think this one is probably up there with one of the most critical things that you need to understand to have success when seed starting, and that is starting trays that germinate at the same time. There's a few reasons why you want to do this, but they are all very important. Obviously, when you have seeds that germinate at different times, for instance, if you take, let's say, a broccoli, which sprouts in about 3 to 5 days, and put that in the same tray where you have tomatoes sprouting in 7 to 12 days, you're going to have a huge problem. What happens is the broccoli is going to grow up and it's going to start to grow much faster than the tomato will. And what you're going to have happen is over time, you're going to have a really big problem with shading because these lights only come down in one direction. And because they are so close to each other, they're only an inch apart, what's going to happen is those broccoli leaves are going to shade out and they're going to push out and you're going to have a huge dead zone wherever you have those transition points. The seeds that all sprout at the same time, they're going to grow up pretty uniformly and they should all look pretty level and equal. But then if you have the seeds that sprout earlier, you're going to have those kind of smacking on top of them and you're going to have a nice dead zone there where there's going to be, there's going to be either really weak plants, really small plants, or just dead plants because they can't even photosynthesize and grow. Next problem you've got is if you're using a heat mat. Heat mats are not the worst thing in the world, but they can definitely cause some problems if you don't know how to use them properly. We just did a whole video about heat mats. Go check it out. Highly recommend it. When your plants sprout, you gotta turn your heat mat off or take the tray and remove it from the heat. Your seeds at that point do not want the heat, they don't need the heat, and you're gonna stress them out if not kill them. So the question comes up, well, Luke, what happens if half my tray is not sprouted? Well, that's probably because you planted two different varieties of things that sprout at different times. And so your broccoli was on the heat, it has sprouted, but your tomatoes have not sprouted. They could use the heat. Well, then gardeners basically say, well, because my whole tray hasn't sprouted yet, I'm gonna leave it on the heat mat. And then what happens is their broccoli dies. And they say, well, what happened? Well, you left it on the heat. So don't do that. So what would I do to alleviate this problem? Well, if you're going to, and you only have, say, one tray of space, what I would do is I would start with the stuff that matures fastest on the end. That way you're not crowding the middle, right? There's room for them to grow out, away from other plants. And I would start the fastest to sprout and move them this way. And ultimately, ideally, you're not gonna be, weeks apart, you're hopefully gonna be days apart. And then what can happen is you can actually, and I said not to do this in the heat mat video, but when you got a heat mat, I specifically said don't take your tray and turn it like this, but that is what I would do if I had to. If I absolutely had to put seeds that sprout at different times in the same tray, I would basically turn it so that way the seeds that have already sprouted on this side have sprouted, and the seeds that have not yet sprouted are receiving the heat. That's the only time, the only case when I would recommend doing that. But even then, my ultimate recommendation would be, because there's so much room for failure and so much room for mistakes to be made, is just to try to have trays that have similar germination times all within one tray, right? I know that seems a little bit frustrating because not everyone needs this much space, but if that's the case, if that is the case, don't start in a cell tray like this. Like this is a 128 cell. There's 128 cells in this tray. Start your seeds in little 6-packs, tiny little 6-packs, about the same dimensions as these, just a tiny bit bigger. Still gonna be very forgiving, but those little 6-packs, you can space them out, move them around, give you a little bit more wiggle room to reduce the failure. All right, fifth and final mistake that I see a lot of gardeners making, and we'll end on this one, and that is top dressing fertilizer in tiny cells like these. You see, adding fertilizer can be beneficial, and as the plants grow, they do need some food. What I'd always recommend doing is pre-mixing your fertilizer into your seed starting mix. If you've got your seed starting mix here, by mixing in the fertilizer into the seed starting mix, it's naturally going to be in the cells. Now what happens if you forget? Well, in that case, if you forget, I would switch up just temporarily to a water-soluble based fertilizer, whether that be a fish emulsion, a kelp extract, a compost tea, a worm casting tea, or even if you had to use like a water-soluble fertilizer from a big box store, won't mention the name, starts with M, ends in W, we all know what that is. I wouldn't blame you, because at the end of the day, having dead plants is far worse than needing something in a pinch. I'll go on the record as saying that. Don't crucify me for it. But I will say that by top dressing with a fertilizer like even trifecta, if you add a bunch of trifecta here, there's no way to get that fertilizer into the soil very easy, especially if there's a plant already growing in that tiny little cell there. And what's gonna happen is you're gonna have, because this is organic based, most granular fertilizers are organic based, not just trifecta, but literally any one you're gonna come across. You're gonna find it's gonna create a boatload of mold. You're gonna have a huge, nasty mold mess right on top of the soil, and that's not good. If this was your container, you had a plant growing in the center, you could take your finger or a fork or whatever, swirl it around, you could top dress no problem. But when they're this small, I see a lot of gardeners just throwing some fertilizer right on top, and then they water, and then they have a huge mold outbreak, because that, whether it's feather meal, bone meal, blood meal, whether it's some type of manure like chicken manure, pelletized cow manure, there's so many different types of fertilizer that you can get. They all are organic based, and mold loves organic things. So it becomes a huge problem because it's damp, and then it's organic, it's organic material right there, and the mold just thrives on it. And then that ultimately is going to affect the health of your plants. So pretty please, do not fertilize or top dress. Just mix it into the soil. Remember this before you start seed starting. That's why I'm mentioning this. Before you start seed starting, mix it into the mix. and your plants are gonna be fine. A little bit goes a long way. Your seedlings don't need that much of it, but having some is important. Otherwise, if you forgot and it's too late, don't try to fix it. Just fix it once you put it out in the garden, right? Fertilize with your granular fertilizer once it's out in the garden, and switch it up just temporarily to a liquid-based fertilizer. You'll thank me later. So those are the 5 next biggest gardening mistakes I see gardeners making when seed starting. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to share this video with someone you think would benefit. I really appreciate that. It helps spread our content around, it helps spread our channel around, and it ultimately helps gardeners make less mistakes, which is our goal. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care. Bye.